Good evening, family, and welcome to another Howard Thurman Thursday. My name is Gabriel Cloud, and I proudly serve as the president of this amazing program called the Morehouse College Chapel Assistance Program. I will be centering us this evening on Howard Thurman's meditation, Pain Has a Ministry. Many years ago, life was characterized by a great poet as a valve of soul making. The basic notion being that all of the experiences of living have as a single purpose the growth and the development of the soul of man. That is, the development of the quality in human life that would give to all the rest of living a sensitiveness, a depth of being, which would put man in the fullest possession of all his powers. In other words, make man to be whole. There is a quiet strength in such a picture because it takes the dread out of the painful and the tragic aspects of living. It is not unreasonable to assume that men are enriched and joyed by the good and the beautiful and the satisfying. Men can accustom themselves to such things as their due or as part of the gifts of life to the children of men. But what about pain? What about the hardships, the things that make life miserable? It is perhaps a daring notion to say that pain has a ministry which adds to the sum total of the life's meaning and, more importantly, to its fulfillment. And yet, through all the ages of the life of man, this idea has kept pace with the growth of the mind. There is a ministry of pain, and the poet suggests indirectly that its ministry is the making of the souls of men. But in this idea lies a very certain danger, namely that specific pain is sent into the life to perform a ministry in that life of the individual. This idea is current among those who say, in the presence of tragedy, we bow humbly before the will of God. But this idea is deadly because it yields the mind of kind of fatalism, of despair, of futility, which stunts spirituality and destroys the basic faith in the goodness and wisdom of our God. It is necessary, therefore, to distinguish between the ministry of pain in general and that of particular circumstance. Concerning the ministry of pain, it can be said that any tragedy has inherent in it positive good. One is not under any necessary or necessity to discover this fact, but one may. And this is important to remember. Given the fact of pain as a normal part of the experience of life, one may make the pain contribute to the soul, to the life's meaning. One may be exacerbated, grounded down by it, but one need not be. The pain of life may teach us to understand life, and in our understanding of life, to love this life. To love life truly is to be whole in all one's parts, and to be whole in all one's parts is to be free and unafraid. Our Howard Thurman meditation. Tonight, I'm so excited to be introducing our moderator for this event, Anti Blackness and the Law, the Reverend Paul Anthony Daniels II. Reverend Paul Anthony Daniels II, class of 12, is an Episcopal priest, assisting clergy at the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine in New York City, and a second year PhD student in systematic theology at Fordham University. Reverend Daniels is from Raleigh, North Carolina, and received his BA in philosophy from Morehouse College and an MDiv from Berkeley Episcopal Divinity School at Yale Divinity School in New Haven, Connecticut. He has served congregations in Boston, Grahamstown, South Africa, Raleigh, and New Haven. Broadly, his interests are in theological anthropology, doctrines of God, mystical theology, Black feminist literary criticism, and queer studies. Specifically, his work attempts to reimagine the archive of Howard Washington Thurman, class of 23, in light of innovations in Black critical philosophy around questions of the human, by suggesting that some of those innovations might be read queerly, as prefigured in Thurman's thinking about divine human relations, while further suggesting that Thurman may offer Black study a way of theorizing transcendence that doesn't bracket or abject enfleshment. Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Paul Anthony Daniels II. It's good to see you, my friend. How are you?
Good to see you.
Good, good.
Me, Gabriel. Thank you for having me. Morehouse, Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome into the conversation Professor T. Anansi Wilson. Professor T. Anansi Wilson is an award-winning scholar of law, literary and cultural studies, a racial justice strategist, and an author of creative nonfiction. Their legal research is situated in legal philosophy, critical theory, political economy, and constitutional law. Their writing and scholarship primarily focuses on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination crafted in response to and resistance against the social, political, and legal realities of domination in the West. They received their JD from Howard University School of Law and are in the final stages of doctoral candidacy in African diaspora studies at the University of Texas at Austin. We welcome to our Thursday Thurman Talk, T. Anansi Wilson.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that wonderful introduction, and it's good to see you out here in the flesh. And thank you for everyone at Morehouse and everyone else watching for having me. If you saw me last week, you already know what I like to do, open up the space with a poem. From there, I'll give a broad outline of the speech and then give a quick PowerPoint so that we can all get into conversation. And Paul can hopefully explicate what I'm saying better than I am. So with that, let's get into it. This is The Occupied Territories by Essex Hemphill. And as I read this poem, I want you to also center ourselves and think about Black life and Black bodies and Black living and Black joy as occupied territories. So the poem reads, "You are not to touch yourself in any way or be familiar with ecstasy. You are not to touch anyone of your own sex or outside of your race and then talk about it, write it down, photograph it in explicit details, or paint it red, orange, blue, or dance because it is yours. You are not to touch other flesh without police permit. You see, you have no privacy. The state wants to seize your bed and sleep with you. The state wants to control your sexuality, your birth rate, your passion. The message is clear. Your penis, your vagina, your testicles, your womb, your anus, your orgasm, these things belong to the state. You are not allowed to touch yourself or be familiar with ecstasy. The erogenous zones are not demilitarized. That is The Occupied Territories by Essex Hemphill. You see, the problem is, in part, that the police state for Black people is not curtailed, nor is it restrained by the constitutional protections of law. We're told to rely on the Constitution as a check in order to limit the power of the state and the ability of police to trammel against our privacy and impede our protections. But, to riff on Frederick Douglass, what is the law to the Black American but a sick and bloody noose we are made to mark as our salvation? The recent incidents inside the home, neighborhoods, workplaces, and most sacred spaces of Black murder victims are tragedies in their own rights, but also because they reveal how unstable these protections are. They reveal that we are indeed the Black in Black letter law, our bloodletting the ink that binds the nation's values, power, and most favored pastimes. Indeed, this is what I'm calling the strict scrutiny of Black and Black queer life. We are nowhere safe, whether standing or sitting, whether still or in motion, whether submissive or rebellious, we are deemed a living, furtive gesture, targetable, and always already available for public, private, and government-backed violence. The project I'm presenting to you is largely one that is descriptive. It links the current moment in Blackness and Black life with the historical remnants of laws used to regulate Black folk. I'm drawing upon a genealogical account of race and law that reveals how the laws regulating Black people, from slavery to Reconstruction to Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow, have persisted. And in this research, what I've found is how state contact, particularly contact with the police as representatives of the state and white folks as deputized police, function as a badge and incident of slavery and an extension of enslavement itself. And the consequence of this state contact, the surveillance, the harassment, the regulation of our existence, acts as an ongoing imposition of subordination and unfreedom, and a disciplinary response to our assumption of and our grasp at citizenship. This interdisciplinary talk explicates and explores what I've coined as furtive Blackness, which illuminates how and why the legal protections we typically rely upon in the Fourth Amendment and the liberties guaranteed to Black folks by the 13th Amendment fail to bear the fruits we were promised. A dream not merely deferred, but made into a living nightmare. Indeed, the fruit we are force-fed is as strange and deadly as the apple offered in Eden by the serpents. The tree is poisoned, both due to the way legal actors read Black bodies, Black being, and Black living, and how it and they self-normalize both routine and extreme encounters with the police state and its deputized actors. Black people only furtively belong in any space. Whether the space is public or private, Blackness, even under the Fourth Amendment, is a furtive state of being. Black persons are unintelligible as human beings under law. Black folks are fungible and always already made to fit the description, for which the prescription is always more violence, always more indignity, and existence both in and outside of law. You see, we are inside of law insofar as we are reachable by its disciplinary arm, but outside of law in terms of being beyond its protective powers or interest. Race and Blackness itself renders African Americans indecipherable as a people, worthy of protections, privacy, and political power. The violence, the imprisonment, the disenfranchisement so aptly described by scholars like Michelle Alexandra, Ronaldo Walcott, Imani Perry, Christina Sharp, and Saidiya Hartman is a feature of such a regime, and it is not a bug. This has a destabilizing effect on the day-to-day lives that people live. Instability in our lives is quotidian. Violence is the air we breathe, and anti-Blackness the weather and climate we must contend with. Later, after the presentation during the Q&A, I'm hoping we can get into thinking about what it might look like to provide stability, safety, and security to Black folks on a more equitable basis, and if that is even possible. But this question must be understood in the genealogical context of a history that links Black persons and Black bodies to how they have been historically criminalized and surveilled by the police states. I'm hoping to demonstrate how the excessive nature of searches, seizures, and detainments, and yes, police contact itself, inclusive of non-badge white folks, are foundational and fundamental to our current constitutional regime. I'm going to sketch this out as much as I can, and hopefully, again, we'll get to talk about this in the back and forth. But finally, in summation, before we get to the quick PowerPoint, furtivity is a regulatory schema that maps the expectations, limitations, and possibilities of Black folks for privacy, freedom, and security within a limited space dictated by the comfort and sanctity of white folks, vis-a-vis the consumption and subordination of Black life, Black death, and Black being. We are rendered furtive by law, from the womb to the tomb, and this is where we start. We could go on to the PowerPoint, please. Again, the title of this talk is Furtive Blackness, Black Flesh, Black Presence as Probable Cause, and Reasonable Suspicion. So I'd like to start off with some basic definitions. You can see from the screen what these are, but I'll quickly roll through some that are very relevant. So furtive essentially means a sly action or being of a shady character. So it's not just what you do, it's who you're assumed to be. A furtive gesture is this movement without leave. This is generally what police use to engage in violent contact with Black folks. Fugitivity is this notion of being in constant flight or movement from duty, labor, or service under law. We can think about fugitivity in terms of the Fugitive Slave Act, which we'll get to later. Manners, you can read that. Thomas Jefferson's prediction that there's this kind of endemic animosity between Black folks in the law and those that own slaves and those that are descendants of slaves. And Black fungibility is essentially this notion that Black folks are indecipherable for one another. And racial hieroglyphics is this idea that Hortense Spillers talks about, that no matter how far one is from slavery, the notion that Black subordination is kind of written upon our flesh, written upon our skin color. So it's something that is available upon sight. Next slide, please. So the problem is that we're rendered furtive. We're dealing with routine police contact, violent police encounters, inaccess to public safety services. So food access, citizenship access, being able to have a wellness check without being killed. The notion of inherent criminality. No matter what you do, where you are, what your job is, where you come from, there's this understanding, this assumption that one is about to get into criminal behavior or one is a criminal by nature. And lastly, we'll talk about qualified immunity, which gives this rise to the reasonable fear of police officers that allows them to kind of engage in this violent contact with Black folks. Next slide, please. So the Fourth Amendment essentially gives everyone, ostensibly, this right to be secure or free from government contacts in their persons. That means your body, in your house, so need a warrant to get in there, your papers, whatever it is you have on you, and your effects against this unreasonable search and seizure. So essentially the police are supposed to, and the government is supposed to, have a reasonable argument for engaging with your body, entering your home, engaging with the things that you have on your person. They can't just willy-nilly search you, seize you, or detain you, or anything that you own. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief overview of the 13th Amendment, and I think a lot of times folks don't actually understand what we're talking about when we get into the 13th Amendment, right? So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, except for the punishment of a crime. And this is where we kind of get into a hairy area, right? This exception in the 13th Amendment allows for us to get into the backlash of Reconstruction. So instead of Black people being formally enslaved, what you get is vagabond laws. You're walking down the street and you don't have permission to walk down the street, or you don't have a job. So now you can be arrested and essentially leased out to former slave owners to do work and to do labor, right? This amendment also gives Congress the power to create laws that abolish anything resembling slavery, right? And to regulate private and public activity. And the case that's cited here, Jones versus Alfred, it also gives the Congress the ability, and the right rather, to abolish what we call the badges and incidences of slavery. So those things that aren't quite slavery, but probably are coming out of the afterlives of slavery itself. You're talking about subordination, you're talking about low wages, you're talking about different forms of discrimination that continue to live after the formal regime of slavery itself is abolished. Next slide, please. So again, we talked about this a little bit, but this notion of comportment is the idea of how Black folks are supposed to act and how those actions are then kind of written into law to be made illegal and not just something that's offensive or, in other words, gets on someone's nerves, right? So this is idea that there are these precedents of suspicion. What makes a Black person suspicious, right? The Federalist Papers give us this notion of a 3/5 clause that we've all heard of, being Black people being 3/5 a person, 2/5 property. And that is something that continues to live on in the ways in which Black people are attempting to kind of access citizenship, right? There's a remnant of obedience and a remnant of one being seen as property and owing, with the Dred Scott decision, service or labor for life. Next slide. So this slide is kind of giving us just an overview of what's happening from the Black Codes to the present. If you're not familiar with the Black Codes essentially are these laws that are written both before and after Reconstruction that try to curtail the rights of free Black people, that say you can only gather with so many Black people at a time. If Black people are out after dark, they're obviously getting something criminal, so they can be arrested. If you're sitting on a stoop, you can be arrested under vagrancy and vagabond law. So these are these types of laws that essentially regulate the movement and non-movement of Black people, the employment, the non-employment of Black people, the political activity, and the political, how can we say this? The notion of Black people not getting involved in political activity itself. So it's no matter what you're doing, it creates a legal space of criminality for you to be imprisoned and then be put to work for either free labor or heavily depressed wages while engaging in this type of labor. So you can go to the next slide. So on this slide, we have on top Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, And on the bottom, we have Michelle Alexandra, the author of this book called Sexual Profiling. And one of the things that Michelle Alexander notes is that there are more black men rather, under state supervision now than enslaved in 1850. Part of that is obviously due to there's more black people in the country. But the thing that stands out is that we still have black people, black bodies under state supervision doing free or heavily underpaid work for states, for private prisons, and for private corporations, right? More than we did before slavery itself was ended. So that's something to really kind of begin to think about. And this is often due, most of these arrests, most of these folks being in prison are due to this notion of the war on drugs, right? Compounding these types of policies, surveillance, search, and seizure. So with that, with the war on drugs, the law kind of opens up this space that gives itself more power to engage with black people via these laws, to imprison them, to surveil them, and to suppress their actual rights, but to also continue to keep this cheap workforce that also disallows, via felony laws, folks from actually engaging with voting. They're disenfranchised and also unable to access things like housing, food benefits, and also healthcare subsidies in certain ways. Michelle Alexander is giving this notion of sexual profiling. What she's beginning to talk about is the ways in which black queer people, black trans people, and women, black women writ large, are profiled based upon what they look like, right? So we can think about in Arizona and New York, these kind of walking while trans laws, and these laws that kind of catch up not just transgender black women, but black women in general, for wearing a short skirt, for walking home late at night from a bar where she might have been working, or might have just been having a drink and being caught up on laws that are saying she essentially looks like a prostitute. So now she's able to be arrested because she manifested the intent vis-a-vis her body and her outfit choice, right, to engage in prostitution. Next slide. So this is the key point of the presentation, or the key data point that I really want you to take away. In 1792, the Fugitive Slave Clause is something that's put into the Constitution. There's a 1793 Fugitive Slave Act and also an 1850. So essentially, this clause is known as the Fugitive from Labor Clause. So the idea is, and folks that are familiar with the Black Church will get this, is that Black people are stealing themselves away to freedom unjustly, right? So essentially, if you escape from slavery, you go up north. Now you can be recaptured by anyone who suspects you of being a former slave, right? And this is in response to the British case, Somerset versus Stewart, which essentially says that upon entering free lands, Black people are free. The United States didn't like that. And the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which we'll talk about in a moment, was in response to this case called Prigg versus Pennsylvania, where a woman named Margaret had been freed by her putative former owner. His descendants then sent a slave catcher up to Pennsylvania to return her and her freeborn children into slavery. He kidnapped her. He was arrested, and at this time, Black people couldn't testify on their own behalf, and she was later busted out of jail. He sued and said that his rights to capture Margaret were violated, but Pennsylvania and Philadelphia this time are free areas. So we'll get more into that in the next slide. So under this 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, you have runaway, formerly enslaved Black folks that are coming up from the South up to free territories in the Midwest and the North. What this does is it not only strikes fear into the heart of free Black people that live in these communities, welcoming folks up vis-a-vis the Underground Railroad and other methods, but it also says that now white people who see somebody Black, who you may or may not know was formerly enslaved, you may know it's free, you can be penalized an amount that is, I think, $20,000 in today's dollars for not turning them in over to the authorities. This law actually creates what we now know as the U.S. Marshals, right? And this is the first time there's an actual federal police force, and it's created just for the sake of capturing Black folk. And just think about how crucial this is, because at this time, remember, Black people are unable to testify to the fact of their own freedom. So anyone can accuse you of being a runaway slave, of stealing yourself away to freedom, of felony offense. And if, in fact, if they don't accuse you, that white couple, that white family, and even that Black family, that free Black family, can then be fined what is $20,000 today and up to 6 months or a year in prison. So it doesn't actually matter whether you were free or formerly enslaved. The notion here is that you're Black, and Blackness itself becomes a threat to the community because it means white folks and free Black folks can now lose not only their freedom, but their livelihood. Next slide, please. We talked about this kind of Prig versus Pennsylvania already, and this notion that Black people, again, become fungible, right? And again, this is just more data. You can take a second to kind of read through this on the case that Margaret is going through, right? How she's being abducted, how her freeborn children who've never been enslaved, right, are able to be stolen into a slavery they never knew, even though they're born in a free state. Next slide. So the Fugitive Slave Act that I just talked about, of course, is part of the 1850 Compromise. This $1,000 fine in their time, stand corrected, is $30,000 today for failure to apprehend a suspected runaway, right? So we can also talk about this in this legal language of reasonable suspicion, right? So suspicion is something that is actually marked onto Black folks at the moment of, well, preceding the moment of the Civil War. So this type of thing of Blackness coinciding with suspicion is actually a legal feature of our Constitution. Next slide. And so the Black codes, we talked about them a little bit earlier, but it's something that's important to notice that these existed not just in the South, but also in the North. New York is a space that's known for some of the most restrictive Black codes in the country, even though we don't think about that now. And so that's why it's important to kind of think about some of these walking while trans laws, because they're actually kind of modern manifestations, right, of regulations of Black women's bodies and Black people's bodies writ large that come out of these Black codes. What are you wearing? Where are you going? What time of day is it? Why are you standing still? Why are you sitting on a stoop? Who gave you permission to go this place? And how do we prove against the assumption of your criminality? Next slide. Some of the ways that we can think about this in modern times, right? This notion of furtive Blackness, this notion of our bodies, our flesh being suspicious, and that suspicion being both reasonable and also the call and the kind of logical underpinnings of the violence that's visited upon us. So we can think about Michael Brown and the cry that comes from that afterwards of hands up, don't shoot. Because the idea is if your hands are not seen, they must be engaged, not only in violence, not only in something criminal, not only in something suspect or suspicious, but in something that allows an officer, that allows a private deputized citizen to engage legally in deathly violence, lethal violence against you. We can think about Trayvon Martin and Ahmaud Arbery, this type of notion of private policing and stalking and surveillance and hunting of Black men merely for being present in a space that they're not wanted. With Tatiana Jefferson, we note that it's not even safe for one to be in their own living room playing a video game with their nephew. There is no safety in the privacy of one's home. So this begins to mark again how the Fourth Amendment, this notion of a foundational constitutional protection for the right to privacy, to be secure in your home, secure in your body, secure in your persons, does not map onto the Black body completely. And how a wellness check could end up being a death sentence. With Bernicia McBride, a sister who had just been in a car accident, knocking on a door, asking someone to call the police. Her presence itself is seen as a particular type of social and legal trespass. And it ends in her death because her body is seen as a coming promise, a coming threat of certain violence, even though she's the one that has barely survived a car accident. This last point about stop and frisk and being unsafe in a car goes to this idea, again, to the strict scrutiny of Black life, that Black people are strictly scrutinized wherever we are. And the most dangerous place, oftentimes, for a Black person is actually in a vehicle. There is a case, a Supreme Court case called Terry versus Ohio and Matt versus Ohio, where we get this idea, we get this legal rule of probable cause and reasonable suspicion. It was actually improvement on what we know as these kind of slave codes that says if you're going to stop a Black person, if you're going to stop anybody, you have to be able to articulate with a reasonable amount of specificity why were they suspicious. But we're seeing again, this was in the 1960s, we're seeing again, this is not mapping out for protection of Black folks. Black drivers, 65% of all stops, yet 31% of the population of South LA. Somehow, Black people are more suspicious. And if you take this data seriously, if you take the officer's explanation seriously, more dangerous, more needing of stops than anyone else. But if we go back to data that we get from Ferguson, that we get from other parts of the country, we understand that many of these cities subsidize or enhance their state budgets with quotas for traffic stops. So not only are Black people in a precarious situation when it comes to policing and losing their lives, but also losing their economic wherewithal vis-a-vis these particular types of profiling that happens in our cars and the ticketing that comes from it. But also, when you're thinking about things like LA and Ferguson and St. Louis, the inability to drive, which is something that is very important in sprawling, suburbanized cities, because you can't even get to work. So on many levels, it's a strike against one's economic wherewithal, but at the same time, even if you're not losing your actual life, you're losing your ability to enjoy the fruits of living because you don't have economic freedom. Next slide, please. That should be it. So in summation, I'm calling for this and also phenomenon as the life that can arrive us at a space.
You went out for a little bit, T, but beautifully done, beautifully done, beautifully done. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. These PowerPoints.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I want to. I'm so excited about this talk. I want to dive right into the point that you said that you wanted to talk about in the beginning of your talk, right? Which is, we can slow walk it though, right? We can just really stretch the whole thing out. I want you to indulge me here. You wanted to talk about, correct me, sort of if there are possibilities, right, under the law for the flourishing of Black life. Right? And one of my major concerns, generally, one of the things that really vexes me is precisely this point that you make about the Black codes, precisely this point that you make about the afterlife of slavery, about the wake, right? Which is really to raise the stakes of temporality, to say that past isn't past, right? That the present isn't only contaminated with the past, but the present and the past are really coterminous realities. And insofar as we see sort of these through lines between enslavement, the Black codes, and present day sort of anti-Black violence, do we even have a language? Do we have even the capacity to imagine legal arrangements whereby anti-Blackness isn't always already baked into the pie of how we think about protection or how we think about care and so on and so forth? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I've been struggling with writing this dissertation and also the book, is this notion of how do you create a grammar for protection that isn't actually protection against Black people or from Black people or from Black freedom. Right. And so I think that is the issue. If you think about the law itself, the law, as I tell my law students, is based upon precedent. So really what we're living with, to your point and Christina Sharp's point of living in this kind of wake, right, is we're living with the Constitution as a living will, as the white supremacist, racist, misogynorist, capitalist forefathers. Right. So every law relies on a precedent law that precedes it. And the ultimate precedent of law in the United States is coloniality and slavery. So how do you get out of it without a new constitution? And if you do make a new constitution, How do you create a new constitution that is not constituted by the underlying logics of the former constitution?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, because a part of the violence of anti-blackness, is like what we would say is the derivation between Black people and Blackness, right? We are constituted by these violences. Our own desires are shaped unconsciously by modernity's understanding of what constitutes the proper human, right? What proper comportment? What does ambition look like, right? Like that. Like we are not safe from the logics ourselves. That's really I think that's really the thing. Which isn't to say then that we don't live this doubly veiled life, right? Where we are deeply kind of intoxicated by and imbued with the violences that rule our lives, but also there are socialities whereby we live in a different space, in the interstitial spaces. Can you talk a little bit about interstitial spaces where you see possibility for imagining life otherwise?
I think that is something that is really interesting and really difficult. I mean, Saidiya Hartman does a wonderful job imagining this and talking about wayward lives, right? And I think that some of the easier spaces to kind of imagine this is when we're thinking about like Black queer spaces, for example, right? So you're thinking about Black queer individuals being in sometimes the Black communities that are not more homophobic than anybody else, but still have these types of ways of policing the Black queer body. We are forced to kind of imagine, what does it mean for me to be both and always here, yet want to be safe, right? And so that lends us to the conversation around abolition. Yes. And so we'll go into our communities and we'll say, or people will often say, well, let's maybe have, community policing, because I don't want to be robbed. I don't want drugs in my community. Right. Yet we're also still dealing with the reality that it's less likely that you're going to be killed by the neighborhood drug dealer, by the officer that's supposedly there to protect you from this particular type of violence. Right. Yet that violence itself is made by the state that creates the conditions for one to need to be a drug dealer in the first place, and for one to need drugs to escape a particular type of ongoing living plantation that we're stuck on. Right. So the question of how to imagine beyond is one that's complicated, because Black people are often not given the space to think beyond what it means to live in the wake and the afterlives of slavery. Right? Because who will protect us? Because we're not given the power, the imagination, or the space to protect ourselves. And if protection itself is defined as protection from Black freedom, then how does the Black unfree person begin to define what freedom looks like?
Right.
So we get caught up.
That's the vicious cycle of it. I mean, that's the demonic part about it, right? Just to be straightforward. I'm really fascinated and interested in this question of abolition. Does abolition feature prominently in your own life and in your own work? Is it something that you're thinking about and thinking through?
Not so much abolition itself, but I try to think about this differently, because I think abolition, I think it's really important, and I think it's a liberatory framework. I think it centers the law and the state's role a little bit too much. So I try to think more about Black disposability. And the kind of central question for me is, do you believe that Black folks are disposable? Any Black folk, no matter how terrible or violent or broken, right? And if you can answer that question, you can say that there is not an irredeemability to Black living, to the Black person, to the Black body, then you're already engaged in a more radical praxis of abolition. Right? But that's something that it's scary to get into. Create a lot of horror stories.
Walk me through that one more time, right? The distinction between Black disposability, you said, abolition.
Yeah, because abolition itself oftentimes is thinking about, how do we get the state, the carceral state, the police state, right, out of our homes, out of our communities. But what we're not often thinking about is, how do we become the state in our homes, in our communities? Right, and that goes from the way in which we raise our children. How do we react when they do something wrong? Do we spank them? Do we, for lack of better terms, we beat the hell out of them? Or are we able to sit with the fact that this is a human being on a journey? And how have I created the conditions for this Black child, or in many of our cases, Black adult, to sit with the fact that they've caused harm and I felt harm, and my response doesn't have to be a harmful one, right? So how do we sit with what I'm calling a critical love ethic, right? What does this practice begin to look like day in and day out? And how do you decenter the fact that you've been hurt, that you've been offended, that you felt some moment of indignity, then revisit or transfer that power onto someone else, which is what the police do, which is what the state does, right? And I think that sometimes with abolition, the focus begins to be on the state, on the police, and not the prosecutor within.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, but of course I'm thinking about sort of these surprise, in trying to sort of reorient ourselves, learning how to take care of our family members or our friends who are caught up in carceral, like legit sort of literal sort of carceral situations, right? I'm thinking about Ruth Wilson Gilmore and contingent relationships or unexpected affinities that come out of, and so it seems to be a both and situation, right? Whereby you're like, you are centering the state in a particular way. There are some real apparatuses that need to be undone, but in that movement to dismantle, there are surprises that emerge in our coming together, and which brings me to this question of love. Because I'm so ambivalent about the word love, right? I'm ambivalent about it because it's one of those things, I think, that we know, right? Like in our bodies, but to some extent, but to the extent that we can name it, it seems we do bring some kind of shape around it, right? We carceralize, right, this concept itself. So how can we think about love, making love, being in love, living in an ethic of love that allows for it to be contingent and to move and to flow and to develop? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And it makes me, when I'm thinking about love, I'm always putting Maya Angelou in conversation with Toni Morrison, right? Maya teaches us that love liberates. It doesn't hold, right? It sets you free, and it should push you to be your higher aspirations, ones you can't even imagine. But Morrison reminds us in Beloved with Seppa, she says, thin love ain't no love at all. When Paul D's told her love is too thick, it's too heavy, he can't carry it, what you're doing, right? And so when we put these things in conversation, it is one to say that just because you are practicing love with somebody doesn't mean that they're practicing love with you. And two, it's to say that love itself is a practice and an ethic and not just a feeling, right? Because it's one thing to be in love. It's one thing to engage in a critical love ethic that says, at least for me in the way I'm defining this thing, that your freedom, your being, your essence is wound up with mine. And not only is it wound up with mine, our freedom and our practice of love, our critical love ethic is wound up in the communities that we interact with and we create, that then goes on to sustain or undo the institutions and the organizations and the systems that we're engaging with. So for me, when I'm thinking about this critical love ethic and trying to get away from this kind of, I don't know, sometimes the pop R&B version of love, it's realizing that love itself is a sustained practice that allows people to be within and outside of relationship with you. And so it's not just about how you are together, it's also about how are you apart,
No, I hear that. We also need the pop R&B.
A little something, a little Donny Hathaway in there.
Right, balance.
Yes.
Yeah. What are some, if you don't mind, can we talk a little bit about, because a part of the real tragedy of academic study is that, particularly Black studies, Black critical studies, feminist theory, queer studies, it comes out, right, of this commitment to, right, to a political life. And there would be people who say it too often gets gobbled up by the university in a way that is not committed to politics, right? I don't believe in that dichotomy. I don't think it's that strong. Sorry. But can you just talk a little bit about what are some of the practices in your own life that sustain you and also feed and inform how you think and how you write and why you are thinking in action, right? As Ronald Judy would say.
Yeah, so I'm very much guided by Audre Lorde, and in that essay she wrote, Uses of the Erotic, and also by Baldwin's essay, The Creative Process. And that is to say that anything that I write, any talk that I give, is grounded in something that I've experienced or that my family's experienced. And secondly, if I'm not going to write it, if my mama and my grandmama can't understand it, right? So for me, it's beginning to kind of think about that Fannie Lou type of practice where it's about, okay, this is great theory, baby, but how are people getting free? And that does not mean to say that every essay or article you write is about to be some revolutionary liberatory thing, but it does mean to say that, like, how are you honoring those that have come before you? Are you testifying? Are you witnessing? Are you making those unspeakable things spoken in evidence? And secondly, what are you doing for the children that come next? So when I write a piece, when I'm studying for, this dissertation defense, I'm thinking about my nephew, Davion. I'm thinking about Imani. I'm thinking about Avani, all my nieces and nephews and my cousins and those folks that I've met throughout my life. And I'm thinking about, is this true for them? And we might have different truths, but am I creating a space where their Black life can be a little bit more free? And so for me, it's about having an ancestral practice, but also having a futuristic practice where I'm neither stuck in what I believe to be the future or imprisoned by what I believe to be the past.
Sure.
How do I hold these things in tension while also living my own truth and being vulnerable with the work?
Right. I think that's a really beautiful way of attending to time, right? It's not often. I think one of my own preoccupations with secular studies,
yes,
is that spirituality doesn't always find its way in as an explicit thing that inspires or moves the thinking process. And so the question then becomes, like, from where are you reasoning, right? Like, what even motivates the critique? Is it just antagonism? Is it just violence? But those are like value laden things that seem to be inspired by a particular grounding. So it's really beautiful to hear you talk about having like a real spiritual, beautiful and unusual to hear a secular scholar talk about having spiritual grounding as that which moves their process.
Yeah, I think, for me, and we haven't talked about this before, but, I was ordained when I was 14 as a Kojic Reverend. I left all that behind me. But the thing is, when I was going through that process in my life, I was not clear whether it was going to be anti-Blackness and all of the poverty things I was going through that was going to kill me, or was it going to be this theology that killed me first? Right. But I knew, even then in my little 14-year-old spirit, right, trying to deal with sexuality and things, that there was something beyond what I was being told, right? And that's why I go back to Audre Lorde's Use of the Erotic. There is something about spirit that transcends whatever you can say with the power of your tongue, right? When you are one with yourself, there are different knowings and different utterances that your body and your spirit can lead you to that go beyond anything anyone can put on a page. And it goes beyond what you might hear in somebody's pulpit. That's between you and God and the universe and your ancestors. And that is something that I've been able to really hone in on over the last 10, 15 years. And for me, not only has it saved my life, but it's also allowed me to create scholarship that speaks beyond the kind of rigid nature of law, or sometimes the performative nature of Black studies and Black queer studies and political theory.
I hear you. I want to return to that initial question. So, we've talked about we've talked about the tensions between or some of the complications, right, that that come into play when we think about the long jury of anti-Blackness and how it is a contamination, more than a contamination of present. But I am anxious to hear what your thickest imagination is for a future wherein Black life is protected by the law. What is your, like, what does that look like? What does that kind of system consist in?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I would not be here right now.
You can't escape it. You have to try.
Yes, but with that, I don't identify as Afro-pessimist, even though I think it's a really great framework. But
Okay.
I think that for me, realizing, particularly in the context of the United States, where Black people are 11% of the population and quickly dwindling, that I don't know that there is a space where Black people can be protected by law. But I do think that if that were to exist, it would first mean an entirely new constitutional convention. It would mean a constitution that is written by and created and informed solely by the folks that are most impacted by it, which again, of course, are Black folks and other non-Black people of color, but principally Black people. And what would that look like? That looks like having a constitution that has equity and reparations at its center. That also means for Black people understanding that Blackness itself is an ever-evolving experience. There's no one way to be us. And that's the beauty of us, because we're often find in opposition to what white folks are.
Yeah, right.
Right? And of course, that definition of Blackness is a constraint, but there's also a beauty in it, because it means that you are not the master. That means you are not the one engaged in surviving and thriving off this parasitic relationship.
Theoretically.
Around you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think it's a different convention.
As some of us try, or at least, get close.
Yes, people really want to be using the master's tools, but
right. I think that is the first time that I've heard someone articulate. Because again, I appreciate and respect, iterations of Afro-pessimism, but I don't necessarily identify as, right? And I am kind of ambivalent, right, about the future and about possibility. But that is the first time that I've heard someone articulate, a new constitutional convention. I'm not in the law, right? So maybe this is something that kind of floats around. But how common is that as a sort of dream for what can correct the sedimentation that is in the Constitution that we have?
It's not that common. That's why I'm surprised they let me become a law professor. But I would say, to answer your initial question again, the other way, and I think actually the more simple way to get to a notion where Black people are protected under law, is to actually apply the 13th Amendment. Strike this kind of criminality loophole from it, and also really apply this notion that Congress has the power and the duty to eradicate the badges and incidences of slavery from everyday legal life.
Sure. Yeah.
If you took that seriously,
right.
It would literally wipe the slate clean.
Yeah, I have a brilliant friend right now who, I won't say his name, but he's an assistant general counsel for a education policy firm. And he is adamant that if we just, think about the 13th Amendment in how it's shaped without the BS that, of this sort of like, no slavery but part, he says that it can do so much more than we have allowed it to do. And for some reason, that's completely slipped by me, and I'm sure tons of other people, in terms of its efficacy.
Yeah, there's a lot of scholarship on the 13th Amendment, particularly how it's been interpreted by the court after the 1950s and 60s. I think I quoted the Alfred Meyer case in the PowerPoint. But the other thing is 13th Amendment is great. That abolishes slavery. Sure. Emancipation Proclamation actually made manifest. That's great. But really what you would actually need is the 14th Amendment, right? The Equal Protection Clause. Take it seriously. Equal protection under the law, and Black folks are citizens. Because you can deal with the 13th Amendment and abolish slavery, but you need the 14th to say you're a citizen. Right? And so if you actually said that like Black people are entitled to equal protection under the law and how it's been interpreted, so not just equal protection, but also there cannot be disparate impact or a discriminatory intent. If we took that seriously, you'd be in a great place. So really, I mean, I think your friend is right, but it's the whole Reconstruction Amendment package, 13th, 14th, and 15th.
Right. Is it in your estimation that taking the whole Reconstruction package seriously would mean also then like the end to neoliberal capitalism, to racial capitalism? I mean, because what we're talking about here is not just a set of amendments, but we're talking about amendments in cahoots with an economic infrastructure that does more determining for what the amendments can do and say than the amendments in some kind of raw state themselves. Could it be corrective, right? Could the amendment itself be corrective of the economic infrastructure that sustains anti-Black violence?
I mean, so one, I'm not going to give the radical Republicans of the North in the 1850s that much credit, but I will say though that if we look at what happened right after the Reconstruction Amendments are passed, before the backlash to Reconstruction, we're seeing the South completely run by Black folks. And not only that, but we're not seeing Black capitalists take control of the state legislators. We're seeing Black people engage in this kind of socialist, community-based policy legislating across the South, right? And so I think if we're able to imagine what would have happened if that would have been undisturbed, particularly now you have the Black people that are majority of the South, right? Not just this 35, 30%, 29%. You might have, at least in the South, a completely different world today, right? Where you really have, we like to call Atlanta the Mecca, where you would really have a proper Black Mecca, where Black people actually own land and are still community-based, coming out of a communitarian type of politic that is the plantation, honestly, right? So like, if that is allowed to flourish, I have no idea. I can't even begin to imagine the type of politics we might even be talking about today as the next step for freedom, or the next step to not even just freedom, to some type of like Black utopia thing going on, right? And I'm not going to imagine ain't no crazy Black folks running around wanting some power, but that's what I'm like. if we're able to have an economic baseline back in 1862, what could we have accomplished 150 years later?
Yeah, no, I hear you. I'm so ambivalent about how much desire has been shaped by neoliberal capitalism.
That's right.
I'm just like so suspicious of that. But no, I do. Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. We're gonna take 2 questions from the chat, and I hope that I'm just looking at the chat. I hope that like, can we talk about the role of religion in dismantling anti-Blackness?
Oh Lord. You go ahead, Reverend.
What? This is your talk. Yeah. The role of religion in dismantling anti-Blackness. So I think about this from a specifically Christian point of view, and specifically what Howard Thurman would call the Negro idiom, right?
Yes, come on.
Slave religion, which I'm always trying to specify as, yes, informed by the ambivalent reception of Christianity by slaves in the New World, but also that ambivalence comes by way of making decisions about what to do with the story that don't ascribe to the kind of like systematic rights and wrongs of a particular kind of Western understanding of Christianity. So for me, a part of the way that religion can combat anti-Blackness is by paying more attention to what the liberation theologians have to say, in particular about Christianity, and that that God incarnates God's self as the slave, right? As a means of freeing us not from some debased state, but freeing us into in the flesh, raging against the empire. I think that the story at the center of the Christian narrative is always already a story about raging against empire. And that's from the lens that I receive the religion as it's been given to me.
And I think for me, stepping outside and coming outside the space of Christianity, thinking about ancestral practices, I think that like if we center our ancestors and what they've experienced in the lives that they lived through before slavery, even, right, we're able to actually exist outside of a Western paradigm itself. Right. If we're beginning to think about West African religions and we're thinking about stories of Anansi the spider, we're thinking about Anyanwu, we're thinking about Orisha, then this notion of subordination itself is displaced as natural. Right. And so I think that, and also, if we're seeing honor and connection with the ways that our ancestors lived, then this notion of Blackness itself as a negative, separate kind of or oppositional connotation to whiteness, then itself is displaced. Right. It becomes about the journey. It becomes about interconnectedness. It becomes about, to your point, the displacement of this kind of space-time continuum.
That's right.
So I think that there's many ways of getting at it. And I think that both of these kind of approaches allow us to step outside of law itself as determinative and law itself as divine or natural.
Right. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, because that's the problem, right? It is political theology, right? It is the way in which the law has taken on the name of God, the signifier of God, God's self. What's so annoying is that, I that's what's happened. That's what history has given us. And at the same time, that is just the way in which the signifier God has been deployed. It's not a God problem, right? I mean, that's a Europe problem.
Right.
And so how do we imagine, as you said, these sort of disruptions of space-time, infinity within the world, right? It always already is, which continues to, in my opinion, sort of war against these normative, violent conceptions that have turned themselves into sort of a false idol.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, if you think about like how the judge operates in the courtroom.
Absolutely.
The judge operates as essentially, like the king did, God's earthly manifestation. And criminality becomes basically exchangeable with sin.
That's right.
So if someone's a sinner, they go to hell, allegedly. And if someone's a criminal, they go to prison.
Right.
The wages of sin are death, and the wages of breaking the law are life sentences or the death penalty. And you're able to give someone the death penalty by the authority invested in the judge vis-a-vis God. Right? So it's very, very interesting. If you think about like the ways that criminal law is written, most of criminal law comes out of this notion of these crimes being sins against the populace.
That's right.
So it's very strange.
That's
strange thing. Different religions.
That's right.
Or none.
That's right.
I think it's really interesting how you all have been creating tension among so many ideas that most people would not think about. And so I'm here just taking up space, listening to the brilliance that both of you are bringing. I think we have time for one more. And so let's engage together once again.
I think James asked, how do we talk about security in the context of disposability? What does the role of security play in this question of disposability?
Yeah, I think that one thing Saidiya Hartman writes about a lot, both in Lose Your Mother, but also in the Wayward Lives text, is the notion that like, if you have actual freedom and liberation, there is no security, right? And that the wages and the cost of freedom is literally insecurity. So what do we do with that, right? And so you have to kind of take seriously the notion that if you are free, the ability to encounter harm does increase exponentially, but only insofar if you have not created a value system in the community that you're within. Right. The problem with security today is that violence in the United States is something that we see as not only quotidian and normal, but also necessary to get to where you want to be in life.
Right.
Create a different paradigm. you might have a different result.
Exactly. I mean, and back to that really takes us back to Quincy's question about what role does religion play in dismantling anti-Black violence? Because in many ways, a belief system provides that sort of mediating concept whereby when you do choose freedom, right, you're choosing freedom with the understanding that you're protected in a way that the world perhaps cannot discursively understand or provide for. Howard Thurman, since it's Thurman Thursday, in Deep River, the Negro Spiritual speaks of life and death. In the introduction, he's talking about the sorrow song, and he says, you know, hope had died by its feeding on itself. But the slave still placed their lives in the hands of God with a maniacal kind of incurable optimism. I mean, and that's, you know, that's the thing, right? Like when you have decided that political hope is too restrictive, right? That the politics of the world are too restrictive for the kind of freedom that you truly desire. What is going to sustain you in the sort of, you know, pursuit of those freedom dreams? And that's a part of the role that religion plays, I think, in sustaining. That is the security, right? Religion can give to one in the sustaining of freedom dreams when freedom does mean often no protection from, when it means risk, pure impossibility of guarantee or something like that.
And what security do you have now, Black folk? I mean, that's the real question. What is this imagination of security that you believe you have?
Right.
You know, who's protecting you now when you're unfree?
Right.
You know? So it's and again, and Gabriel, please feel free to jump in on this, but again, it goes back to our earlier conversation about these mythologies that we fed ourselves about being free. I mean, about being safe, about being secure, about having rights. You have none.
Right.
Mere right that a Black person has that is not violated on the regular.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's important that these kind of conversations happen, because once persons of color, Black people, get to this level of financial security, we think that we are, you know, so separated from these ills and these qualms and these problems. And I think it's important that we notate that no, your Black skin is just as evil and sinful as a person with $10 and a person with $1 million. You are still seen as, you know, automatically culpable because you are Black. So
yeah.
I just want to say thank you.
It does.
I just wanted to know, do y'all remember like 10 years ago when Oprah was in Norway or Sweden or somewhere?
And everybody talks about this story. Everybody talks about this story. When she's trying to buy the handbag.
Yes, Oprah can own your company. What do you? So if Oprah can't walk around freely, baby, I don't know what security the rest of us got. You know.
Yeah. And this is why I think this is why, you know, really like a truly transformative freedom struggle in this century is really going to have to be, is really only going to come on the heels of us addressing desire.
Yeah.
And what we desire and what ambition looks like, right? Because it can't be the case that we all think we're going to be on the Forbes list one day, you know? And not only can that not be the case because that's not a possibility, because that's not how finance capitalism works, but also because it is directly counterintuitive to the kinds of freedom that people suggest that they want for Black people. And until we realize that kind of vision for wealth is incompatible with the vision for freedom, and this is just going to be a vicious circle of us like talking about this for whatever, the next 100 or however many years the planet is still operable.
And that time is shrinking daily.
Yeah.
But before we close out, I have a question for both of you. What 3 books are you reading right now, or would you suggest to chapel assistants or those listening to this broadcast? Take your time.
Reading right now. Wow.
I'm reading a book called Discourses in Life Philosophy by Donna V. Jones. It's about Henri Bergson, who Thurman would have been reading, and like vitalism. Anyway, but I think it's a good book. Also, R.A. Judy's Sentient Flesh, Thinking in Disorder, Poiesis in Black. It's a very long book and it's very hard, but if you're a young scholar, I highly suggest it as like kind of like a bibliography of Western philosophy and Black critical studies.
So I'm rereading books right now since this is, I think I'm turning my dissertation in on Monday, final draft. So thank God I can finally do something for pleasure. So what I'm rereading is this interesting, like, African spiritual sci-fi series, Children of Blood and Bone.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Also, if you have Audible, listen on audio, because that voice over it are just like, you're in a whole other world. Like, what do you say?
Who's reading it? Do you know who the reader is? It the author?
No, it's not the author. Her name is Binny. Let me not even mess up her name. But it's just on Audible, so just go ahead and check that out. I'm also rereading Maya Angelou's Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. I feel like it's something that always centers me, particularly when we're thinking about like love practices. And the other book that I'm reading now for the first time is, what is this book under the computer called? 400 Souls. That's edited by Ibram Kendi and Keisha Blaine, which is an amazing collection of stories from the last 400 years of Black life.
Okay.
Thank you all both. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Wilson, Reverend Paul, thanks for your time, and we will be in touch. God bless you both.
Bye.
So, family, we have come to the end of another Thurman Thursday. Thank you so much for inviting us into your homes, into your living rooms, your cars, on the treadmill. You all have decided that the Thurman Thursday was something that you want to listen to and participate in. So we thank you for that. This week, we will not be having our Vesper Hour or Thurman Thursday. Well, next week, Vesper Hour and Thurman Thursday, because Morehouse College, the AUC, is in midterm. So keep praying for us, and we'll keep praying for you. We'll see you next time. Have a good night.